So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Aesthetics. I am Don Adisha, and I'm very glad to have you here with us tonight. We're going to be talking about building your aesthetic leadership pipeline, how to develop the next layer of leaders inside your practice before you need them. So, tonight is about one of the perhaps biggest growth constraints in aesthetic practices, when every important decision, relationship, or even standard still depends on the owner. We're going to talk about how to spot that dependency early on, how to identify leadership potential inside your team, and of course, how to build capacity before a crisis forces the issue. Now, a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. We are recording and you will receive a replay link after the session in your email so you can share it along with your colleagues and partners. However, do not let that make you passive. The real value is happening here right now, live. Use the Q&A button for panelist questions and use the chat for conversations and quick reflections. I'll have my eyes on both the feeds, so please participate as we go along. Right. So tonight's panel is proudly sponsored by Echo Marketing. Echo is the marketing growth partner trusted by more than 500 healthcare practices and industry leaders across North America and beyond. Their work focuses on three areas that matters a lot to a growing practice: SEO and visibility, conversion-based websites, and of course, content and the social authority to back it up. So in simple terms, they help practices get found, get trusted, and of course, get chosen. Um, they are trusted across the USA, Canada, the UK, and we are truly grateful for their support in tonight's conversation. Now, we will hear more from Equa a little later in the program. Right. But before we get into the main session here, we do have a quick tip from our partners at Equa. Now, this slide here on your screen frames something important tonight. Your leadership capacity gives you the room to grow. Predictable patient demand gives your team room to lead. Now, as you build the next layer of leaders inside your practice, your online presence also has to support growth beyond the owner. Equa helps practices strengthen visibility, trust, and conversion so that new patient demand does not depend on one person doing everything. So, as we talk about internal leadership tonight, keep the external demand in mind too. Be found, be trusted, and be chosen. And we do have a special resource for everyone here, so stick around to find out more. Right then, here's how we're going to structure our evening. First, the hidden leadership gap. Why growth stalls with every decision, relationship, and standard, um, along with the owner. Then, second, how to spot leadership potential, how to identify people who are already showing that ownership, judgment, and influence inside your team. Thirdly, how to develop leaders practically. So, what to delegate, how to coach, and how to turn leadership into a repeatable working system. And of course, last but not least, how to create that leadership culture where accountability, decision making, and initiative are expected across the practice. Now, let's get to know our panelists and then let's get to work. So, first up, I'm very happy to welcome Sarah Schickman. Sarah is the founder and managing attorney of Lingea Law, a national healthcare law firm focused on regulatory, transactional, and strategic matters for medical aesthetics, medical, and of course, wellness and telehealth businesses as well. Now, she helps practices think through MSO structures, corporate practice of medicine compliance, multi-state expansion, and partnerships. Sarah brings a very practical lens to tonight because she understands both the legal structure and the real operating pressure inside growing aesthetic businesses. Sarah, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Great. Happy to have you here, Sarah. And next, I'm excited to welcome Annie Robertson Hockey. Annie is the president of Skytail Group, a leading investment banking, management consulting, and private capital firm serving healthcare consumer businesses. Her work sits right at the intersection of strategy, operations, growth, and practice value. Tonight, Annie will help us look at leadership capacity, not just as a management issue, but as a real driver of enterprise value and owner optionality. Annie, welcome to the panel.
Thank you for having me. It's a treat to be here.
That's great. It's great to have you here, Annie. And then, last but not least, we are also joined by Samara Bell, Senior Associate at Lingea Law. Samara works on healthcare transactional and strategic matters, including mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships for medical providers. She brings a clear, practical perspective on what needs to be documented before owners truly transfer decision authority, and of course, how practices can protect both the business and the patient experience as they grow. All right, Samara, welcome to the panel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, Samara. Now, I'm going to stop sharing the slide so we can begin our conversation. But of course, with that being said, I do want to make that quick reminder. Use the Q&A button or the chat box below to keep, asking your questions or leaving us your thoughts because that'll really make this session much more engaging and valuable to you. Right. That being said, my first question goes out to you, Annie. Now, most aesthetic practice owners don't recognize their leadership gap until a crisis forces it. What makes that uh, blind spot so persistent, and how can owners recognize it before it becomes urgent? Over to you, Annie.
Thank you. It's such a great question. And as a former founder, co-founder, co-CEO of what's now a pretty significantly sized firm prior to SkyTail, this is something I so relate to. Turns out I'd never started a company before. And I think for most practice owners that we're working with, I think the first problem is they're doing several jobs at once, right? They're running accounting and finance. They're chief technical officer, right? They're vetting and implementing new technology. They're HR. They're hiring. They're training. They're dealing with any personnel issues. Not to mention the fact that many are still practicing the primary revenue earner for their practice. And so, I'd say for many of these practice owners, blind spots are candidly out of necessity because they're sprinting, right, and don't have any time to look back. And again, for most of the practices that we're working with, it's their first time building a growing enterprise, and that is something that you learn a lot of hard knocks along the way. Now, that's a problem statement, and I don't love to have problem statements without potential sort of solutions, if you will, as well. And I recommend that really every leader surrounds themselves with what I call a personal board. That is a combination of advisors, right? Lawyers, consultants, accountants, folks that have pattern recognition, and their job really is to spot your blind spots and let you know in advance where those are. That's mentors, folks who you collect along the way who have built, great teams or companies, families, what have you. And then also peers, right? Making sure that you are in contact with other folks who are sort of, can relate maybe to your day to day. And I will say I have a personal board. It is something that I rely on often, and has spared me, I think, many bumps along the way. And then finally, the last thing I'll offer is ask your team, right? Create forums for feedback, whether that is a monthly open office hour or one-on-one check-ins or even anonymous online surveys. Your team is wise. They're there for a reason, and they see a lot. So, most times I have one-on-ones. It's what can I be doing better? In this call, what do you think could have gone differently, right? And making sure that that's a safe and open dialogue for your team, because again, you can learn so much from them.
Check. So really, to find that leadership gap, what you would recommend is getting that personal board, right? And then, of course, perhaps uh, conversating with your peers. And then, of course, last but not least, asking your team, what are the
Yeah.
gaps that you're seeing right on the floor? Right. That's a great place to start. Thank you very much for that opener, Annie. Now, Sarah, practices with 3 to 10 employees are often too big to run casually, but too small for formal HR. What does poor leadership usually look like in that stage?
Yeah. And I think a lot of practices are in that stage where they're too small for formal HR, but it's not just one person. I
Mhm.
think that poor leadership in those types of practices is really when everyone starts coming to the owner or the main person in the practice, whoever that is, with all the questions and nothing is written down. And so that becomes a problem where nothing can get solved without getting approval from the owner or getting a question asked from the owner. And a lot of times, if the owner is not there, if the owner's, let's say, on vacation or it's a Friday or whatever the situation is, things start to break. And then that also means that if the owner is very busy, things start to slip. So
Mm.
the solution to that is to really think about if you want to take your leadership to the next level, really writing down some of the processes that are in the owner's head, but now need to live on paper to develop new leaders because none of us can read each other's minds. Like we don't
Mhm.
have that skill as humans. And you can't expect your staff to be mind readers either. But if you have clear standards, clear protocols, like do you do a certain procedure, yes or no? How do you clean the front desk? How should it look? How do you greet a patient? All those things should be written down, and all those things will help you develop the leaders from within.
How do you clean the front desk? That's pretty nitty-gritty. For anyone who has tried to develop a real SOP, they know how painstakingly long it can take sometimes, especially on details such as, like you mentioned, it's important. So I'm just curious, Sarah, like, how would you justify that time taken to really, get things down on paper? How would you justify that to an owner who is more concerned with, I don't have time for that, I can do another procedure, another treatment, and just keep things moving? How would you help them justify that?
I would tell them that used to have a med spa that had one room. And when I had one room, we could do these Band-Aid solutions where people could tap me on the shoulder and I could tell them this is the answer. But then all of a sudden we had 12 locations across multiple states and they couldn't tap me and get the answer. And I didn't want them to have the wrong answer. And so the
Mm.
Band-Aid solutions no longer work for practices that get bigger. So I would say, think about yourself. Like, how many supplies of Band-Aids do you want to have? How much money do you want to spend on your box of Band-Aids that's going to be on the desk? Rather than spending money on that, maybe you just take 10 minutes every day. Now with a lot of AI tools, you can do a lot of powerful stuff. Take 10 minutes a day and say, okay, I'm developing something that's like a structure, not a band-aid. And then also that structure, when it comes time to sell your practice, is going to make things worth more. So it's a really
Mm.
good investment of 10 to 15 minutes a day.
Check. I really appreciate that. Break it down to 10 to 15 minutes a day instead of, taking a weekend to write a full how do you clean your front desk manual. So appreciate that, Sarah. And now we're going to move on to Samara. Samara, when a practice owner is unexpectedly out and the team has no decision authority, who actually absorbs the fallout first, and what does that cost?
Yeah, I mean, I think first would be the patient, right? I mean, the patient, there's hesitation, which is a delay, and the patient is confused and they want a resolution. So I think, immediately it's the patient. And then,
Mhm.
kind of the second casualty with someone out is the team member who's standing in front of this patient because they're paralyzed. They don't know what to do. They haven't been put in a position by a leader, trained and equipped to handle the situation. And then they lose trust in the practice and their team, and then, ultimately confidence, which affects them how they do their job. In terms of the cost, I mean, I think it's, somewhat easy to quantify. It's, a lost booking, it's a refund for the patient who's having the issue. It's, bad reviews. I went into this practice and no one could help me. And so, and on the team side, I think it's more of a cultural kind of cost, right? So it's, staff not being prepared, afraid to make judgment calls because they haven't been trained. And then, they're just kind of waiting and it's this awkward limbo period. So, in order to scale and build a practice, you need trained team members, you need to, know who to go to. If you have to immediately go to that person or how to handle it in someone's absence, it can't just be, oh, the boss took a sick day and now we can't answer any questions. I don't think that's helpful to anybody.
I
So
also
where do we start? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that my consulting practice will do is what we call diligence on behalf of a buyer, a med spa, or an asset that they're looking to purchase. And so that's given me the unique advantage of understanding what they're worried about and what they prioritize in terms of what to purchase and for how much. And one of the top things that we talk about is key person risk, which is usually centered around a founder or major provider. And it seems counterintuitive, but your ability to fire yourself from your job and not have that impact revenue will actually earn you more money. That will directly sort of impact what we call your enterprise value. I see Sarah and Samira nodding because I'm sure they see this too, where it's both a win for you because it means you can go on vacation maybe every once in a while and things don't fall apart, but it also really will, if you do decide to exit, which of course not everyone does, it really will affect the amount that your firm will be purchased for.
Check. Oh, right. Key person risk. Now, I was just curious there, where can we really start to address this problem? Samara?
Yeah, I think that goes back to Sarah's earlier point, kind of having protocols in place of, written, it's like she said, it's in her head, but no one can read her mind. So it's, having things written, here's what to do in these circumstances and how to, treat certain patient complaints, who's handling it. And if this person is in here, who's next in line, that person's properly trained to do it. So there are no gaps in terms of, helping patients and treating.
Check. Protocols in place, no gaps, will really elevate that whole practice owner missing kind of problem and let the practice thrive as an enterprise, like Annie mentioned. Um, right. Now, Annie, how do you distinguish between someone who is operationally excellent versus someone who can truly lead people and culture? And can you teach the later?
Let me unmute myself first. Yeah,
Um,
it's a really good question. And, I think I'll sort of like put myself back and, I began my career in tech startups in Silicon Valley. And I think that this is a lesson that like old school Google learned was
okay.
that your best engineers need to
Mhm.
have a promotion path that is not necessarily management, right? Because what makes an incredible engineer, and normally you promote an engineer who's really good, they're good at their job, I'm
Mhm.
going to promote them, but what it takes to be a really great engineer is not necessarily what it takes to manage and coach and train up folks. So there really is a difference between the two, not that one is better than the other. Um, I'd say I would start with two things. One is to ask, and one is
Mhm.
to listen. I believe in letting folks speak for themselves. So asking folks on your team, what do you enjoy most? What does a successful day look like for you? What's bringing you energy? What do you hope for your career? Now, of course, that needs to be in partnership with reality, right? So as a manager, I think your job is to sort of watch and see what tasks your people gravitate towards and excel in, right? Because what we're all seeking for every employee, ourselves included, is that beautiful mecca of what you're good at, what you enjoy, and what the firm needs, right? So that's what we're trying to find for every single employee. Um, and I think, to answer your question spot on, like, can leadership be taught? I do think that there's certain aspects of being a leader that can be taught. I went to business school. I paid a ton of money to go to business school. Hopefully that taught me something, right? Maybe that's
Mhm.
the best way to structure meeting agendas. Maybe that is the best way to use specific language to talk to an underperforming employee that makes it not a threatening conversation, but a productive one. Those are tools, right, that can be learned. Now, there is a piece of leadership that I don't, candidly, like, this is my sort of anti take, I don't think can necessarily be taught, and that is um, something that is innate in a person that drives them to strive for excellence. That is a person who is staying up 5 minutes late to check the schedule one more time for errors. That is someone who asks, how can I be better versus the part of the standard status quo. And in my experience, that is not incentives that do that for folks. Of course, we need to have good incentives in place. There's just something in some folks that just, you know, encourages them or pushes them. I think probably all of us in this meeting have this or think we have this, encourages us to lean in and just always do that extra 5%.
So Annie, when you're hiring, are you looking for this factor? Is that a big consideration when you're hiring someone? This drive for excellence?
Yeah, it's a great question. The need to be a leader depends on the role. When I hired for my general counsel at my last company, I was looking for really different skill sets. And, then I was for my controller, then I was for my head of product, right? For a controller, you want someone who's like really risk averse and very detail oriented, right? For someone who's head of product, you want them vision focused and maybe more willing to take on risk. But I do think across the board, striving for excellence. I mean, SkyTail, I think, one of our core pillars is just excellence in how we interact with every client, with every customer, with everyone on our team. And so that is something that I think for me is kind of a table stakes.
So what exactly are you looking for? Like, what is the signal that says, okay, this person is really striving for excellence?
That's a really good question. I think that I mean, I always do case studies. I think just sort of interactive exercises. It's also a way to make sure that you're hiring in a meritocratic way. There's a lot of bias that goes into hiring. And so if you have sort of a take-home exercise, for example, it can really remove that from the equation. Um, but I was actually recently talking to one of my mentors, and he was telling me that when he is interviewing, and this is a man who's built extremely large private equity firm and it's very impressive across his career. He was saying he always asks them what their first job was and how they spend the money, which I just found like the most hilarious sort of like, did they spend the money to buy a bunch, like articles that they could read? Did they spend the money on DVDs? Did they spend the money? Did they put it in a bank account? Sort of like, what was that? But I think you can sort of simulate questions, asking people about recent cases. What is something that, keeps that up? What's the last thing they do before they close their laptop at the end of the day? There, little ways to simulate, again, sort of that just doing the extra 5%. But, I think there's no perfect formula. So I'm still learning on my toes too.
Well, I mean, but that's a great place to start. What's your first job? How did you spend? That'll, really get into the psyche of how a person thinks about, their well, whether they're going to invest or just have a really great party, Oh, it's my first
Yeah.
paycheck.
I worked my first
Bye-bye.
my first job was at Safeway Bakery. So I don't know what that says about me, but I learned how to frost a cupcake very well when I was in high school.
That's amazing. I mean, perhaps that we'll talk about that later, how that came into, really help you with your creativity and all.
Mhm.
Um, because I get curious, just too curious sometimes. Samara, when an owner is deciding between developing someone internally versus bringing in outside leadership experience, what should that drive? What should drive that choice, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, what problem or problems you're trying to solve, right? So if it's a gap where it's, perspective, then maybe you need an external candidate to come in. Maybe you've hit some kind of ceiling in a certain area and you need someone to come in and say, hey, this is how I've done it, at my other employment or in the past, and here's how I can correct it. I think if it's more, a knowledge gap in terms of, familiarity with your own systems and operations and clinical protocols, then maybe we look internally, right? That's someone who's probably in the best position instead of someone coming in, starting from scratch and trying to understand it. So, I mean, I think it's problem specific. There's, maybe you can plug external into the opposite way I said it, but I think the easier path, depends on kind of what you're looking for.
Hmm. Can you give us some examples of when it's okay to go external instead of really developing that internal capacity?
Yeah, I think it's, if you're maybe looking to scale in a certain way and you don't have someone, internally, if you're looking for a position that doesn't exist internally, right? Maybe you're bringing on an HR for the first time, something like that. And there's no one who has those skills. I think there are soft skills people have, and when those, are internal candidates, maybe they can translate. But, I think it kind of depends. Clinic to clinic. But I think it's, a lot of times, and it's hard because, you bring in an external person and it's also a cultural thing and it's, absorbing
Hmm.
them into your current culture. And so, that's the risk there. And then the risk with the internal person is, are they up to the task? And, if it's someone who's been there a little while, either have confidence them or you don't. And so you kind of have a better handle on whether that person can rise to the occasion for that role.
Hmm. So, what would really drive that choice is scaling, is it? How you're going to scale in a certain way. Now, it's curious if there is licenses involved, say, for example, like yourself, an attorney, the answer is pretty simple. We can't develop that internally unless, there's a huge dedication. There's someone like Sarah or yourself who's like, yeah, I'm going to ace the bar. Give me 4 years. But perhaps we need them right now, right? So they need to call you. But I don't like to say it, but like, let's just keep playing HR, marketing, people take this like, okay, you can kind of develop those things internally. Um, how would you like, what have you seen through your consultations on how that can go right and can kind of, go wrong?
I think, how it can go right is when you have an internal person and they're looking for a challenge, right? I think that's a person who's ready to take on the challenge. They have some ideas, and I think you can, talk to them first and see what kind of ideas do you have, and kind of get a sense, right? So what kind of leadership, what kind of leader they are now in their current role and how that translate. I think externally, it's a little harder, but I think you want to look at their body of work, right? What are they doing now? How have they grown in their practice? What kind of leader are they there? What initiatives have they taken and look at it that way. So it's similar in terms of, body of work. Internal is the advantage because you know this person obviously, better and more intimately than the external candidate.
Shit. Thank you
I
very much,
also think
Samara.
like whether there's someone to train, HR and marketing are specialized skills and really important. And promoting a junior person into a role without mentorship is a disservice for their professional development. In fact, I would actually argue hiring in an expert that can train them up is probably long-term advantageous for them. And so there's also
Hmm.
the idea of giving someone a step up opportunity, but not the support to get there. That's not a favor too. Just like one little piece of nuance that I think about.
Yeah,
That's a
I
great
agree with
piece.
that. I mean, I think putting someone in the position to succeed, right? I mean, I think
Totally.
that's kind of the key thing.
Yeah, and what happens a lot in aesthetics is, at least from what we see, because we sometimes help people with employment contracts and job descriptions and things like that. A common transition in aesthetics is, let's say, a front desk person now becoming an esthetician, or an esthetician becoming a nurse. And then their job description subsequently changing, and them not having a lot of um, clarity, and also not being on the same page with their practice manager or the practice owner about what their new job is going to be. Are they going to now be an esthetician and a front desk person? Or are they just going to be an esthetician and the front desk, the phone can ring all day long, they don't have to answer it? So I think there's a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong when you have someone who, let's say you promote, but you don't clarify what happens to their previous job, and you may expect them to do both jobs, but again, they can't read your mind, or in this case maybe they don't want to, and they're like, no, like, I don't want to answer the phone ever again, I'm an injector now. You have to hire someone new. So just be prepared that when you're changing the job of someone internally, you want to have a conversation with them about what exactly that's going to be and what's going to happen to their previous role, and will their job description change?
That's such a good point.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that, because that's a nuance that can easily get overlooked. I mean, we covered great points there. Um, and yeah, really appreciate it.
Sure.
Right. Now, Sarah, I do have a question for you. How do you balance moving quickly with delegation, while of course still protecting that patient safety?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where you have to move quickly, but also check yourself, because delegation is really like a black and white area. So when a practice gets a investigation or an audit or some kind of complaint, it's very easy for the investigator to see whether proper delegation was in place or not. It's good faith exam was done or not, or there was a particular contract in place or not. It's really like a yes or no. It's hard to argue it was done 50%. And so before really delegating too much, always a good idea to check, like, can you actually delegate this? And do you have a good structure in place for it to happen? And we see this a lot, at least in Samara and my practice, with good faith exams, where let's say there's a practice owner and they're a nurse practitioner and they hired their first RN and they're around to do the patient exam and everything is great. And then some days they're not there, but their RN is still working and they're seeing new patients. And then this problem comes where there's no good faith exam, even though there was supposed to be one. And then the practice kind of grew too big, or there isn't a structure in place. But there are these third-party services now where you could have these outsourced good faith exams. So it's definitely a solvable problem. But sometimes it's one of those situations where if you speed up too much and you don't have the proper delegation in place, it is like an easy way to get in trouble legally and very preventable.
I really like that look. Why don't you know? Because otherwise, there is no clear, like you mentioned, it's pretty gray when it comes to delegation. But when you have when you get an audit or an investigation going on, well, they're going to, figure out who did the work, where it went wrong. So why not start it from our internally and think of it in a similar way and ensure that we have all the roles clarified, all the tasks clarified, so that if we do get an investigation going on tomorrow, depending on the delegation, they will be held responsible. But of course,
Yeah.
ensuring that that person can take the task on beforehand. Am I getting that right, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, delegation is one of those things it's easy to get in trouble for when you don't do it correctly, because it's easy for the investigator to see when something is wrong. But if you're talking about non-critical tasks, like delegating, some things at the front desk or delegating some HR functions, as long as the person is properly trained, great. I would say, okay, delegate, that's wonderful, but also write down the process so that you're not training the person a second time. Like next time you hire a person to do that, then you already have it written down. And of course, I'm saying it, and even like Samara and I and our whole team, we're always like updating our documents every day, because as the practice grows, you're gonna revisit all the things you put in place, but that's not an excuse not to put them in place.
I think we're redoing
Very.
our conference SOP for the like 10th time since I've been at SkyTail right now. So like the second you write it down, it's outdated, but it's it's the only way to scale an organization and ensure certain things are happening.
Really. Mary Ford, I was speaking to Mary Ford, and she's gave me a great definition for an SOP, and that's like a living document, right? So you're always updating it, and really appreciate that, Annie, because you gave us a good reminder that I'm going to keep on doing it. And I really like this, what Samara mentioned earlier on, putting the person in a position to success. So like, or succeed. Um, if you are having that kind of mindset and you're thinking about your decisions in that way, it seems like a lot of these problems with leadership can be kind of curtailed. in a way. So appreciate everyone's contribution this far. And right, I do want to pause here for a minute, real quickly.
And I'll say one more thing to give you some more minutes to do what you
Go
need to do.
ahead, please.
Yeah, so we're talking about
Oh,
SOPs.
there we
One
go.
thing to keep in mind is that an SOP is not a contract. So what that means is, like, let's say you have a great SOP and your person signs that. It doesn't mean that they're contractually bound by what it says. So some people in their SOPs try to put in their non-compete agreements and contracts that you want your person to sign. But really, if you want something to be a contract, it can't be a living document. So it can't be something that you
Mm.
change bilaterally by yourself every once in a while. It has to be a true contract. So just keep that in mind. You can't, people are not contractually bound by the SOPs they sign. Of course, you can give them performance warnings if they don't perform to them, but it's a little bit different than a true contract.
Really appreciate that, Sarah. I mean, yeah, that's the attorney there. Uh, right. So now my PC is back working condition. I hope everyone can see your screens. I do want to pause here for a moment because what have we been discussing is the exact, getting the right internal foundations, of course, building leaders, clarifying those decisions, and making the practice less dependent on the owner. There is also a layer that helps all of that land in the market. So right now, while we're talking, someone in your area may be searching for treatments you offer. Perhaps they're looking for Morpheus 8 costs, lip fillers before and afters, perhaps even cool sculpting near me. Now, they may be comparing practices, reading reviews, looking at websites, or asking Google and AI tools who they should trust. Who they should trust. So the question is, does your practice show up and does your online presence make them confident enough to choose you? That is where echo marketing comes in. Echo helps aesthetic practices understand the external demand side of how patients find you, compare you, and decide whether to reach out to you. So, as a thank you for being here tonight, Echo is offering a free marketing strategy meeting. This includes a comprehensive growth plan, a Google audit, and a local competitor audit against 3 named competitors within 5 to 15 miles, depending on whether you're in the city or a more peaceful location. Scan the QR code on your screen right now, or else you can use the chat link in the chat, businessofesthetics.org/MSM, marketing strategy meeting. It takes under a minute to book, and there is no commitment whatsoever. You are simply reserving a practical review of where your practice may be missing new patient opportunities. So go ahead and grab that link now. Then we will continue our panel conversation. Right, very exciting segment here. Live audience Q&A. So we are getting to your questions, and I saw a couple of them in the chat box below. So how can you engage with us here? You can either raise your hand so that I can unmute you, or else you can go ahead and type in your question in the chat or the Q&A box. Um, if you, because the Q&A box has a really interesting function. It can allow you anonymity if that is something you want. So go ahead and do that. While you do that, I will be getting into some of the questions we have. Link isn't working for me. Okay. Our team will be looking into that definitely. Right. So while that's happening, I'm going to pick up one of our registrant questions here first. Um, hmm, let's see. Oh, I like this one. Dr. Umar has asked, how does a doctor build entrepreneurial skills to run the aesthetic business? How does a doctor build entrepreneurial skills to run the aesthetic business? This is a free for all. Anyone can join in. How about Sarah? You can start us off here.
Well, first, the doctor can be comforted in knowing that in medical school, business skills are not covered. So it's not like the doctor is alone in this kind of problem/opportunity. But I think one of the ways I've seen doctors do it is just by doing. So of course, that's a very expensive way, learning by doing. You do it, you make a ton of mistakes, and you kind of figure it out. You listen to podcasts like this, you attend some conferences and trainings. The other way, though, is hiring a consultant, right? Hiring a really good practice management consultant who can give you 6 months, a year, 2 years of time, and then train you and your whole team on what needs to be done. Or if the practice is big enough, hiring a professional practice manager. So that's also true if you have big visions for your practice. So if you're looking to build a practice that's going to do a couple $1 million a year, you probably should budget to have a full-time practice administrator who's a professional business manager, not your, social media assistant being promoted to your practice manager, also not your, child, sister, whatever, or not even your lead injector. I think someone here also asked, like, what if your lead injector, if you want to promote them? I think it's more of like the engineering kind of promotion that Annie talked about. Like my brother is a senior AI engineer at Google. He does not manage anyone. His kind of level of promotion is just becoming like a more important engineer. So it's a totally
Mm.
different path than someone who's going to be managing, thousands of people. And I think this is the same.
Okay.
I,
And do you
I,
have anything to?
Yeah, I think I guess sort of 2 points, but I'm going to address them in reverse. Just piggybacking on what Sarah just said, I echo her sentiment on the high producing provider. Maybe the exception is if they are leading. I'm like trying to think about like how they can build something greater than they do alone. Maybe if they're a part-time clinical trainer or can spearhead that training practice, then suddenly it's not only their production, but they're ensuring more and more and more production. But that also sort of matters what they want to do. And my first question for any aspiring physician to become an entrepreneur is like, do you like it? Like, do you like that business stuff? And if
Mhm.
you do, that's amazing. Let's lean in, let's teach you. It's not that hard. But if you don't really like it, then outsource. That might be a consultant at first, that might be a fractional executive. And then to Sarah's point, exactly, there will inevitably come as a moment in time where it's time to bring in that sort of management business leader to work alongside you. And that's something that typically happens regardless of how much a medical professional enjoys building at a certain stage, because it's just too much. And so there's something to be said for like, what is the highest and best use of your time? And really being honest with yourself about the tasks you should and shouldn't be doing, and being perfectly comfortable outsourcing the rest.
Check. Dr. Umar, really do hope you get some insight over here. So learning on the go. But just to see if, it's something you like, and of course, hiring the right people and getting some external help along the way when you're scaling. Now, I do have another question here from one of our attendees earlier on, Chelsea. How do you get your team on board following these SOPs as you start implementing these changes slash guidelines? She has asked Sarah.
And Sarah's going to ask Samara.
Yeah,
Like
go
tag a
ahead,
friend.
Samara.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gently. And I think it's also, hey, we're not doing this to punish people. We're not doing this because you do a bad job. I think the message is
Mhm.
we're trying to get organized and we're, doing this for patient satisfaction, customer satisfaction to, be more cohesive as a team. And I think,
Mhm.
that's the message. And also, so things are clear. It's helpful to the employee and to the team to have things clearly written so they can go back and say, okay, this is, how we do it. We have a written document. Um, it's not supposed to be threatening. It's not supposed to be micromanaging. And I think sometimes, you know, I I tell it's kind of like when you sell a practice, I tell, buyer clients, don't, as a general, don't come in there in the first 6 months and change everything. Employees like continuity, they like consistency, they need to know that, everything isn't going to change in what they've known for the last 5 to 10 years. You can start to make changes and improve processes, but employees generally, a lot of people don't love change. And so I think it's just, delivering this message of, yes, this is a new document and this is change, but here are the reasons why, and this is for everyone's benefit.
Yeah. Samara, I really want to ask a follow-up question to that because employees don't love change. That is an underrated comment, I feel like. How can we address that? As a practice owner, how can we address that? How can we make our employees love change?
I mean, I don't know if you can ever make them love change, but I think it's more so comfortable with the change, right? And so I think it's explaining the reasons behind it and the reasons why we're making this change, not just, hey, this is what we're doing. You all have to do it. I don't really care if you like it. It's here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. Here's how it's going to improve things for everybody. And, with all changes, it should be that consistent message so employees can understand where it's coming from and get more comfortable with it. And also,
Check.
kind of being open to, hey, we're putting this in place, feel free to reach out to me as a leader or a manager if you have questions about it, if you have suggestions about it. So it's not a dictatorship, you all have to do this now and do as I say.
Right. Appreciate that, Samara. Um, be cohesive as a team. I really appreciate that. When we do give our team members that outlook, that perspective, how this change is going to make things better for you, for me, for us. It might just make things a little bit more comfortable to digest. We had another very interesting registrant question. This is the last one I'm going to pull out before we keep moving. I think, let's see. And that's from Jean. Jean has asked, when is a good time to offer profit sharing to the team? Annie, can you start us off on this one? What is a good time?
This is a really interesting question. And I think one of my sort of guiding principles of compensation is that you can give it, you can never take it back. And profit sharing is a pretty significant form of compensation, right? As is giving away equity. I think it's really, when your firm, you're scrappy, you're just starting, it's like, sure, I'll give away a few points of equity. Now, when you're transacting, you better believe you're looking at that equity a little bit differently. Um, I have a sort of a friend who started a very successful startup, and the first year he was living on his friend's house, and he gave the friend, I think, 1% of that startup, and that friend never will have to work again. So I think I'd say, it really depends on the why behind any form of compensation. I think it's why, like what behavior are you trying to drive? Um, Now, if it's someone who you really believe has skin in the game and wants to succeed, there are many ways to skin that cat as well. So, you can do um, cash spot bonuses if certain things are achieved, right? If we hit this threshold, this KPI, this KPI, this KPI, it unlocks this percentage of cash bonus, etc. So I think that honestly, I'd be curious what Samara and Sarah think. My main point on profit sharing is like caution, probably, and to think like really, really hard about it. And if you do think that's something that you should be do, please, please, please work with great legal counsel to make sure that you are protected, and that everyone is set up for success and that everyone is sort of incented in the same way.
Check. Sarah, Samara, would you like to add to that?
I could add a little bit. Yeah, I agree 100% with what Annie said. It's complex and you can't take it away once it starts. I mean, you can take it away, but then you're going to be in a legal mess and the person is going to leave. It also involves you sharing a lot about your profit that maybe you were not prepared to do. And it creates a lot of liability in terms of doing that correctly. And if you're actually treating that person as like an equity owner in terms of profit, it's a tremendous amount of paperwork. So there are these kind of midway things you can do, something like phantom equity, where you're not actually making somebody an equity owner of your company, but you're giving them some sort of bonus where profit is one of the factors. So you could set up something like that. That's a lot simpler. But that doesn't have what's called information rights. So they can't just say to you, well, like, okay, show me your financial statements for the last 6 months. But I think it's tricky because also once in an aesthetics practice, people see your profit, in case it is a lot of profit, that it introduces the idea of, well, maybe if I started a practice, I could have this profit too, and do have the owner's profit. So I think it's complex. We've set up a structure where for like a plastic surgeon needed some continuity planning, and we did something where it was a phantom equity. So it's just if certain events occur, the people in the practice get certain payouts. But if, for example, their employment ends, the whole thing ends. You just have to have really clear provisions about, okay, well then what happens if you just lay them off for no reason? They're going to try to have a claim against you for the unpaid profits. So there's a lot of kind of nuance in this particular scenario. I think, yeah, it's complex.
The other thing I would also encourage folks to look into, I love phantom equity. I also love this thing called stock appreciation rights, SARS, if you will. It's a very flattering name. I would encourage everyone to work with their counsel to understand any tax burden that puts on their employee. So if you're granting some sort of equity or stock, that might result in them getting no cash and having to pay taxes. Even though it's something that you wanted to do and it's like out of the goodwill, et cetera, et cetera. So, just thinking through kind of all of the implications, I think Sarah highlighted so many of them.
Oh, that's really amazing. So yeah, Jean, proceed with caution. There are a lot of steps, it seems, along the way that you can try before you commit to this profit sharing model. Not sure exactly what the model you're looking for, but Sarah and Annie gave out really great ideas to consider. But of course, caution, because you can give, but you can never really take back, unless without a lot of paperwork, which no one really likes. I do want to get one more question here because Keo has asked I think to a certain extent, we might have answered it, but I do want to get a bit more clarity here. Keo has asked, at which point should a practice consider adding a general manager to help run the med spa? And what are the factors to consider the pros and cons? Samara, would you like to try this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, when you get to a certain size and you realize you don't have time, right, would be the kind of sort of obvious answer. I think if there are tasks you don't want to do anymore, that, a general manager can do. I think if you are starting to find, you know, things are slipping through the cracks, there's a disorganization issue, that's certainly something a general manager can help with. Just kind of anything where there are enough duties for a general manager to come in. If everything's running smoothly, you have plenty of free time, I wouldn't hire a general manager, right? But I think it's, kind of dependent on, how things are going. And maybe you're like, hey, I want to take vacations every other week. Okay, then hire a general manager, right? So it's really, person specific, practice specific, but a general manager is a great role for someone to come in and just, do administrative tasks, do certain tasks with employees and kind of, run the operations that way.
Check. Anything to add there, Sarah, Annie?
I would say to put some numbers to it. If you're just a solo provider, I don't think you need a general manager. And I would say even if it's just you and one person, two of you, even if you're running $1 million or even $2 million practice, you don't necessarily need a full-time general manager still. But I would think about it once you have more than two people. once you have more than two people, it's going to be hard to think about the marketing, the HR, and everything. And then you could also, there are lots of companies now that do fractional services. So you could always hire someone on a fractional basis. I don't know, Annie, does your company like help support with things like that?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. That's it. We love to do those sorts of things. And I would say too,
There you go.
the one other caveat that I would offer would be if you are looking to transact in the near future, I would talk to advisors before hiring. Generally the thought is like not to make, a bunch of extreme changes to your business before going to market, because that firm that's looking to purchase you won't really know the implications of those changes. And so, again, if you're thinking about a transaction in a year, even within a year, bringing on more headcount. I think there are pros and cons. I would just talk to an advisor, like Sarah and Samara, or another advisor.
Awesome. All right. Okay, we'll take one more audience question here and then we will have to wrap things out. We got Ina asking, what is the best way to go about finding practice managers? Indeed, Glassdoor, Facebook. Annie, you
Well,
can.
I'm curious, Sarah, you've run a med spa, so I'm curious kind of how you approach this one, because it's hard. I don't have a perfect solution for this. Recruiting in this space is really hard. So
Okay.
Sarah, curious how you approached it.
Yeah, so we promoted people from within. So we had some really good front desk people who became managers. That was one way. Another way was in your email marketing to your clients, mention that you're looking for a manager, but talk about it in terms of like a third party company is doing the interviews for you or deciding for you, because you don't want your clients to get mad at you for you not hiring them. So one of our managers or two of our managers were our clients, some of our clients, because you want somebody who is very passionate about the industry too. So of course you could use these recruiting companies and all that, but I would say, yeah, ask your clients if anybody wants that kind of role. And Indeed was good for us, Facebook, Instagram, all of those. I'm not a huge fan of the recruiting companies in this space for those kind of jobs, because it's like the same manager that
Mhm.
goes around to 1,000 different practices. I'm also not a fan of like DMing people who have jobs at practices saying, "Do you want to come work for us?" Because word always gets back to the practice, and it just builds bad situations.
Check. Appreciate that. All right, we have arrived at the top of the hour here, and I do want to go one last time around the panel just to ask each one of you 60-second golden rule for building an aesthetic leadership pipeline before the practice urgently needs it. What is the golden rule? Samara, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's staying organized and, knowing when to delegate, knowing when to seek outside help. And that, really helps with the organization, right? I think, having a disorganized practice really makes it so challenging to continue growing. You can't add a new location when you haven't cleaned up your current location. So, I mean, I think for me, kind of probably the top thing is organization, and a lot of things we talked about, how to get that structure and get organized.
Appreciate that, Samara. Stay organized and know when to seek help. Uh, Annie, how about you?
60 seconds is really hard for this one. Um, I would say, if I had to say one thing, you keep in mind that every single day you are modeling what a leader at your firm does and should look like. And that includes leading with compassion, and that includes delegation, right? Effective leaders aren't leaders who dictate X, Y, Z that happens. Honestly, as a leader, I feel like most of my one-on-ones, I just say, what would you do? What do you think? What do you think? Because at any given time, they may have more context than I do, right? And so, know that you are signaling, and keep an eye on those stars who are beneath you, because um, you know there's some data that shows that managers spent 90% of their time fixing underperformers and 10% of their time on their overperformers. That should be flipped, right? So make sure that you're laser focused on the things that are working and the people that are working and continue to build them up.
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting take right there. Flip that script, work on your own performers. Sarah, what do you got for us to wrap things out here? The golden rule. Are you on mute?
I
Oh,
would
no, you're
say
there.
my golden rule is give the good or the great performance in I can't even speak anymore. Sorry, it's late. I
I'm
I would say my
totally.
golden rule is to give the top performance in your team a chance to shine and to really grow. So really focus on the top performers and spending time with them and also encouraging them to do what they do well and to share the knowledge. So like for us, for example, Samara's a top performer. Sorry, I'm gonna say that about you, Samara, but it's true. And she's like doing a training for everybody else on basically how to be more like her. Um, so it's a little bit of that, right? Like let's say you have somebody who's a great injector and they're great at doing whatever, you would have them train the team on that thing. So really spotlighting your top performers is great.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that reminder to spotlight your top performance players. They they're also people. They like it. Right. That being said, let's start the wrap-up sequence here. All right. So, final last reminder, Echo Marketing's marketing strategy meeting. Do make the best use of that opportunity. Go ahead and book your session if you want to be found when your ideal clients are searching for the treatments you offer in your area. Figure out how you can be found and, of course, trusted and then, chosen. Um, the link is in the chat box one last time, and of course, the QR is on the screen here. That being said, right. Thank you so much, Sarah, Samara, and Annie, for really sharing such a practical guidance tonight. And thank you to everyone who joined us live. And as you exit the webinar, you should see a feedback survey that'll pop up on a new browser tab. Please take a moment to complete it. It'll help us understand what landed and what topics would be most useful to you. And panelists, do stay on the line for a quick debrief. And to everyone watching, thank you so much for investing an hour in your practices, future leadership capacity. I'm Dan Disha, and we will see you at the next Business of Aesthetic panel. Good night, everyone.